I know that it is kind of a trash fire of a time right now, so I really appreciate you all taking the time to be with us in conversation today. I really just want to spend just a moment talking about what Steve and Neil's project is, the Berkeley Center for the New Political Economy, because I think that's important. And then I'll talk a little bit about a corresponding student group on campus, a working group that Professor Summers is a faculty mentor on, the racial capitalism working group. So, and Steve can jump in and add anything that he would like as well if he'd like to. But, that initiative and the racial capitalism working group, with which came shortly thereafter, are both initiatives kind of to try to think about how we might make sense of the deeper, more epistemic questions about political economy, finance capitalism, and moving beyond kind of what we take for granted about neoliberalism and other kinds of, boilerplate frameworks that we've been using in the last 50 years to understand the financial and political world around us. I'm very excited to have a conversation with two really wonderful, astounding scholars today, Professor Rucker Johnson, Professor Brandi Summers, both because I think, as a political scientist, Professor Summers is trained in sociology, even though she's in geography, and Professor Rucker is an economist. We kind of come from very different disciplinary backgrounds, and I think that's kind of the spirit of what we're trying to do right now. And I think as we're moving through triplicate disasters of the coronavirus pandemic, the racial uprising, and the economic devastation that has come as a result of the pandemic, it really kind of is incumbent on us to kind of talk through really what it means to take race seriously and to take racism seriously. I think that a lot of times we kind of make slippages in terms of talking about race when we're actually talking about racism. So I have a couple of remarks that I'm going to start out with, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Summers and Professor Johnson. And then we'll just kind of jump right in. And I really want everyone to know that this is an interactive space. I really would like for us to spend a bit of time thinking and discussing together. Really quick before I get started, I really do want to acknowledge, I don't know if they're here or not, but I really want to acknowledge Clara Perez Medina, who is my partner in the Racial Capitalism Working Group, who's been really wonderful, and probably this would not be happening if the two of us really did not have such a great partnership. So I'm going to say a couple of things and we're just going to jump right in. So a 2009 Wall Street Journal article, "The South's Economy is Falling Behind," shows that as a region, the South's economy has diverged from the average level of national productivity since 2009. The article attributes this to the long-standing economic imperatives of the South to keep taxes and wages low in order to attract blue-collar factory jobs, which in a broader national economy being driven by agglomeration economies, are no longer able to entice the same types of jobs that they were a generation ago. What once served as a unique benefit is now a constraint on overall Southern economic growth. In essence, there are historical factors that have had unintended consequences. The tenor of the article seems to be pointing towards two different parts of an interrelated story for the constraint in Southern economic growth. The first, which the article tackles explicitly, is a story about a regional economic divergence, in which some regions of the United States are suffering from the departure of the richest people and places pulling away from them. This is a subset of a broader school of thought within American political economy on the politics of agglomeration, in which just a few major metropolitan areas drive almost all of the income, wealth, and job growth in the United States. In other words, increasing spatial inequality in the United States has resulted not just in job growth for the regions that are able to capture different, growing, and stable sectors of the workforce, but also results in the negative externalities of driving down growth in many other parts of the country. Point being that the South's economic decision-making and historical financial infrastructure is only partly to blame for the difficulty it is facing now with respect to retaining both blue and white-collar workers. However, as compelling and empirically sound as this story is, a short passage in the article struck me because it pointed to a supplementary, if not alternative explanation. To diversify and lure manufacturing, Southern states, starting with Arkansas in 1947, began passing right-to-work laws that weakened unions and kept taxes lower than in the wealthier North. And they spent less, especially on education. An average of of $1,869 per student in 2009 in 1960 compared with $2,741 nationwide, according to the Education Department. In part, this reflects the long shadow of slavery. In the Jim Crow era, white taxpayers and politicians resisted spending that benefited Blacks, according to historians. The passage here suggests that much of the economic infrastructure now taken for granted within the context of the South's struggle to maintain job growth were not made simply based on economic calculations, but also to protect the racial hierarchy that predominated during the Jim Crow era. Moreover, the decisions made to block the economic progress of Black people at one time can be seen as having a deleterious impact on the Southern economy more broadly in the long term. Political economy tends to zoom out and focus on broader questions of income and wealth share. And while this is critical, what it can often miss are the ways in which these macro trends are driven by particularistic issues happening within specific communities, namely Black communities in the United States. So what I want this panel to do is to attempt to reflect and pause on the ways that race, or rather racism, are at the center rather than at the margins of the construction and maintenance of the American political economy. So I'm so excited to introduce my two co-panelists here. Professor Rucker Johnson is a Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy in the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and Faculty Research Associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research. As a labor economist who specializes in the economics of education, Johnson's work considers the role of poverty and inequality in affecting life chances. He is the author of the book, Children of the Dream, Why School Integration Works. Professor Brandi Thompson Summers is Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Metropolitan Studies, also here at UC Berkeley. Her first book, which is wonderful, by the way, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, explores how aesthetics and race converge to locate or map Blackness in Washington, D.C. In it, she demonstrates the way that competing notions of Blackness structure efforts to raise capital and develop land in the gentrifying city. Her current book project, tentatively titled Routes of Race, Resistance, and Geographies of Belonging in Oakland, California, is an interdisciplinary study that examines the complex ways in which uses of space and placemaking practices inform productions of knowledge and power. The study examines representations and experiences of space, place, and landscape in Oakland across historical contexts. Together, I hope that we can examine the types of risky practices, one that leads to macroeconomic downturns, are born out of racially discriminatory practices, ironically putting everyone, including whites, who these discriminatory practices are intended to elevate, at risk of financial ruin. Or more succinctly, and where I'll start with each of you, Professor Johnson and Professor Summers, how is racial discrimination constitutive of the broader American political economy? So I allow you to kind of take it away from there. And Professor Johnson, if you're allowed, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. So great to be with you. Christian, thanks for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank everybody for our university community for connecting on these important issues. I guess as a starting point, and we certainly want to be as conversational as possible, can you just confirm that you can hear me well? Yes? I had a little bit of some technical hiccups, so I'm glad that got resolved. Okay, so in any case, I think it's important to start from some common definitions. So an aspect of my definition of political economy is using theory and data to try to tease out the complicated interplay between race, economics, and politics. And when we think about the footprint of structural racism or systemic racism, we see it marked in wealth disparities, in educational inequality, in health disparities, in the criminal justice system, in policies and the political representation at various levels of government, but in ways that are kind of illustrated most starkly in our patterns of segregation. And the difficult tractability of structural racism is that there's no single entity or institution or person that's responsible for it. And thus it requires an integration of parts, an integration of policy approaches, intersectional data set of analyses, and to address the policy silos that create and have created systems that reproduce inequality. Now, when people say systematic racism, it doesn't mean lots of racists in the system. It means even if there were zero racists present, that the system would still disproportionately harm certain people of certain races. And it's that understanding that we are trying to kind of have real conversations around, so that we recognize that there are limits to race-neutral policies. And we have to be cognizant. I'm an economist, so I'm just going to say economist, but it certainly stretches well beyond the disciplinary context of economists, but economists' tendency to turn to race-neutral solutions for issues of structural racism. And I think that in our university community, even teaching colorblind policy analysis versus race-conscious, racially sensitive intersectional policy analysis undergirded with historical roots of racial inequality, with an understanding of the legacy of past discriminatory policies that are still having impacts today. And so I guess in my introductory remarks before I hand off to Brandi, I wanted to kind of just spark the idea that there's widespread assumptions that policies that ignore race can solve problems rooted in race. And as my colleague Gary Orfield, I think, aptly described it, when we think about cross-sectional data, it's of a portrait of a photo of a moment. And yet our analyses that are needed have to be rooted in history and longitudinal data that can be described as a movie, or something that better shows the origins, development dynamics. And if you continue that metaphor movie, I'm about trilogies. So if we think about The Matrix and The Matrix 1, 2, and 3, I'm talking about generational connections of the storylines of race and equity in this country. And some assume that that equal access can be solved indirectly by concentrating on poverty. Since race is such a politically sensitive issue, that the problems are often described as problems that can just require an economic set of solutions. But if you look closer, you can just inspect and learn and educate both yourself and our students about the complex race issues. Just consider the history of US racial wealth inequality. That Black middle-class families that are college educated have less wealth than non-college educated white families. Now, you can't understand that without understanding that the misconceptions about poverty being either deserved or a policy accident, it's neither. And so what we want to kind of highlight is that even studies show that the potential beneficiaries of the safety net and public education investments, as those perception of beneficiaries become more racially diverse, that public support for the generosity of those programs wanes. We see that illustrated in the ACA state expansions of Medicaid generosity. The states that chose not to adopt are also the states that had the highest Black share. We see that in the punitive sentencing policy changes, and we also see that in the safety net. And what we want to kind of highlight is in this moment that we want to turn into a movement, what COVID that many people described as a race neutral or kind of leveler because of the ways the biology of a contagion disease operates. But what we realize as we've witnessed is what the pandemic has been is not a leveler, but a revealer of the deep structural inequities that when we return to a new normal, we don't want the old normal, we want a new normal that addresses some of those baked in inequities across domains. So there's a lot to say, but I would like to use that as at least a stimulant as we pursue the next set of dialogue between us and the whole group of our university community. So I'm gonna push tag to Brandi, so both that I don't go on and on, but also so that I can hear your ideas as we engage with the ideas. Thanks, Brandi.
Thank you, Rucker. I wanted to also thank Steve and Richard, as well as Christian, for that wonderful introduction, for putting on this panel. And I know it was originally scheduled for the spring in person, but there are opportunities to having, things online where more people can actually pay attention and engage. So I do appreciate this opportunity. I think, Christian brought up a number of provocations, especially in terms of zooming out as we think about political economy and how it's co-constitutive with race in a lot of ways. Similarly, Rucker brought up some really important points. First being that we need to be really clear about how we're thinking about what political economy is. Certainly across disciplines, we have different definitions or understandings of it, different critiques of it. And so I think it's important for us to situate ourselves in terms of this understanding. And so I agree with Rucker in that sense. So generally in thinking about political economy, we pretty much know that the study of the economy has to be considerate of institutions, values, goods, and practices. So more specifically, we have to think also about how values and interests that govern the economy really involve these political processes and relations. So we can't assume that there's this natural flow of markets, right? So like what Rucker was saying, the allocation of resources, the coordination of production, and the distribution of goods and services really do have this inherently political perspective. And so for the purposes of this conversation, we know also inherently, or hopefully we know, that they're inherently racialized. So in thinking about the political and economic dimensions, specifically in my work and thinking about geography, of how spaces and people are racialized is through those various processes. So I want to take a step back and think about a sociologist. I am trained as a sociologist, though I work in a geography department, but W.E.B. Du Bois and the way that he looked at Black political economy. And he used intersectional paradigms to explain Black political economy. So he saw race, class, and nation as these social hierarchies that shape Black access to property, to status, and also to power. And so to understand social problems that are experienced by the Black community back when he was doing his research, and honestly today, Du Bois thought it was really important to look at how capitalism uses racist ideologies and practices, specifically in the US, and how these policies reinforce social inequalities. And so we can use his research as being really instructive to think about this moment. So specifically as it relates to geography and thinking about this spatial context, to think about race and urban political economy really involves looking at, the relations between social production, urban space, and the complexities that create material inequality in these environments, right? So it's how we understand social formation of the urban environment through what Rucker mentioned, segregation, thinking about containment, also surveillance, right? How it really builds particular subjects and creates these uneven geographies. So political economy, as I see it, is really about understanding these various mutually dependent and intertwined power relations that lead to the social production of uneven environments. And so to answer Christian's question, I think the zooming out has occurred, right? We are really having to think about these macroeconomic processes if we're understanding, let's say, the disproportionate impact or health outcomes of Black and Latinx and Indigenous people as it relates to COVID. As we're thinking about, of course, the uprisings that are occurring at this time that are not only trying to address these health inequities, but also financial inequities that have been going on for quite some time. So really it ends up being this cycle. It's something that is continued, though there are different data points, there are different, there's different scales, and there's also different elements that really do shift how it looks on the outside, but a lot of what's existed has already been embedded in the system. And so again, as Rucker was saying, and I agree, we have to think about segregation as not only existing in the past, but something that's continuing in the future. And so we might use different terms to understand these uneven geographies, but ultimately how development works ends up reinstating this same kind of macroeconomical vision of how Black people, specifically Latinx and Indigenous people, are excluded from, let's say, understandings of how we see white space. They're not given the same types of opportunities. And so that, again, gets intensified in moments of crisis like this. The last thing I'll say, because I'm curious about Christian's questions, is that, you know, as neoliberalism is still a term that I use quite regularly, even though for a lot of people it's out of style, but I still think it's useful. But if we're thinking about neoliberal capitalism as this mode of production, you know, it affects the development and the environments of cities in particular. So cities at the same time end up being these sites of production and exchange and also consumption. And so what ends up happening is environments become commodities themselves. That's what Lefebvre said, right? So if we're thinking about this mode, if we're thinking about neoliberal capitalism and how it's impacting all of our lives concurrently, then I think we can have this greater conversation about how to move forward and how to kind of open up these designations so we don't just focus on individual racists or individual people who are enacting discriminatory practices, but instead see how it's embedded in various institutions and structures.
So thank you both so much for that. I mean, this is great. So before I move forward, if you have questions, I have a couple more that I'm going to say to the panelists, but if you want to ask something, put it in the chat for now, and then we can kind of have a broader discussion a little bit later in the discussion. So a couple of things, there's so much that you both said that I really want to kind of touch on. One thing that you said, Rucker, that I thought is really a great place to kind of move the conversation forward is, you know, when we're talking about how in a moment of systemic racism, you need not have any racists, right? It's a systemic problem that, you know, that the issue itself can be devoid of racists. However, as we're moving through a presidential administration that seems so profligately like incredibly discriminatory and racist in so many different ways, I might want to bracket that and say that another part of systemic racism is also that it makes it much easier for illicit actors to imperil communities of color. So it is the case that, you know, you don't need racists, but racists are able to flourish in a system in a moment of systemic racism. And so as we're thinking about, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, and we're thinking about the ways that multinational corporations are able to make money and profit off of a potential vaccine, moving through multiple stages so quickly, we have to think about the ways that, like, it is something that does not need racists, but racists are able to profit off it very easily. So that's one thing that I want to kind of just flag. The next question that comes out of that for me, as Brandi, you just said, is there is something that the zooming out has already happened, right? But the zooming out kind of allows for this neoliberal capital. So if we zoom out in such a way that we start thinking about, you know, income distribution, wealth share, the top 1%, all these kinds of things that actually are really important. We need to actually have frameworks to understand the movement of wealth across the country and the world more broadly. But the way that we miss it is that in those kinds of focuses, what we do, at least I think, and I would love if anyone would push back, is I think what we do is we say, okay, well, if we just understood this as a kind of a policy measure, rather than something that is kind of, as you said, is commodified within individuals in structures and in communities. So I guess the next question is these are kinds of things that, you know, we have to kind of like, you know, balance, because if we kind of focus in completely and we miss the kind of the income distribution and the wealth distribution, we've also lost something. So the question then becomes, how do we kind of have these kind of productive conversations about racial and economic justice that don't themselves kind of fall into the trap of, you know, articulating disparities as fixed or articulating communities of color as, you know, deficient? How do we kind of have a conversation that kind of centers racism and not race? So that's my next question for both of you.
That's great. That's a really great, great set of points and segue, and certainly that build on the great points that Brandi brought out as well. I'm going to try to break it out in kind of component parts. I think the first part, just thinking about wealth. So I want to kind of make sure we're clear on the origins of the racial wealth gaps, that the accumulation of wealth in predominantly white communities and the concentration of poverty in predominantly minority communities has been government assisted. And so we're not ahistorical about the legacy of those past policies that have gotten us to this point. And the point of raising that is simply that if the policies that played a role in exacerbating racial wealth disparities, then the policies that must be implicated to address them, to help solve the legacy of those policies, should also be policy directed. And when you think about the scale, a lot of our conversations about income inequality, but it's the wealth disparities that are far more enormous and that get less scrutiny from both our data and our longitudinal analysis. So when you look at the median Black household with children has a net wealth of $300 compared to $47,000, $250 for the median white family. Those families have 1% and Hispanic families 8% of the average white family's wealth. We're talking about median family household with children taking in about 50% of the income of white families, but held just 1% of the wealth. And that reflection is simply about how excluded Black families from building housing wealth and passing it down to their future generations. And that's not just from redlining from the past, but even when we look at the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis and the ways in which targeted balloon interest rate mortgages were targeted to minority communities, and we had lifted up housing as the main vehicle for wealth accumulation in the same ways we lifted up higher education, and then had predatory lenders and had predatory for-profit colleges manipulate and kind of take advantage of the system. And so if we think about a safety net in this period in which we have a serious pandemic, one you have to kind of consider is before the pandemic, races in the US is race is the single most significant predictor of the support for and generosity of the safety net. When we have the diffusion of state responsibilities following 1996 welfare reform, evidence suggests that states with larger Black populations, all else equal, holding income, political, partisanship of a state, that those that had larger Black populations that were shown to be less generous and more restrictive in their TANF and Medicaid policies. And the work provides support for the idea that the racialized perceptions of who are the beneficiaries of the safety net and policies directed toward education, that influences public support for the funding of those components, accounting for state median income, accounting for the adult population who are college educated, the share of the legislatures that's Democratic. So as I think maybe, I'm thinking it may have been Brian Stevenson that had this quote, but that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And so when we think about the way forward, there's the old adage that it takes a village. And what we want to add to that is it takes a village and a policy movement. And those familiar with my work will know that I'm very much focused on the school funding equity as a critical part of that movement at all levels, beginning from pre-K to 12. And I think when we talk about a just school funding system, it's one that recognizes that a progressive funding formula that equitably distributes school resources to ensure the promise of equal educational opportunity can be realized for all children, irrespective of zip code, race, ethnicity, and it's really the love of our children that is the motivation, and it is a just school funding formula that's the instrument. And so in all of these spaces, we have to kind of think about what are the precise instruments for social change. And if we're talking about narrowing the achievement gap, it means we're not going to mistake the achievement gap as measured by standardized test scores and mistake test scores for ability. If we're talking about wealth, we're not going to mistake wealth for worth. And what we're really talking about, again, Brian Stevenson has great quotes along these lines, but that the criminal justice system currently treats those who are wealthy and guilty better than those who are poor and innocent. And that's not just something that is kind of quarantined, so to speak, in the policing and criminal justice space, but rather it is a contagion itself that has spilled over into the ways our housing policies function, the way our school funding policies function, in ways that we can see that Black families pay more property taxes than white families with identical valuable homes and get worse schools for their money, for that taxpayer money. That's what we're talking about, embedded, systematic analysis of the structural systems that disproportionately affect minorities. So there's much more to say, but again, when we rewind the clock, we see very clearly that the period of, say, 1934 to 1970 saw the greatest development of housing wealth in modern American history. I'm talking about through home ownership, and it was facilitated by the Federal Housing Administration with public tax dollars, including taxes paid by Black people. And it's the wealth development was targeted exclusively to benefit white people and intentionally kept away from Black communities. And that's why we have to kind of wrestle with the, not just the today, but the before, to characterize what we want the after to look like. So I'm gonna push tag because I know that Brandi has many more great points that she wants to make. And then we certainly want to open up because I do see a number of things entering the chat. So tag Brandi.
Thank you, Rucker. I mean, I think you both said a lot. And so I'm going to try to tackle, I think, what both of you are really thinking about. So with Christian, your question about, you know, centering racism and not race. I think it's important to really understand how we're thinking about repair. And so, you know, reparations has been on the table in a variety of, locally, statewide, and then also federally. And I think there's still some kind of conversation taking place as to what that looks like. Generally, I think in terms of federal suggestions for, or at least federal policy that's been proposed, is that it does try to address wealth inequities that Rucker is talking about. But I really do think that there are other forms of repair that we need to really consider. And that's why this panel is really important in terms of thinking about how race and political economy come together. So on the one hand, you know, Rucker, you were talking about the wealth gap being really crucial instead of focusing on income inequality. And I agree. I mean, we can look at it. Documents now, in fact, going into the future, the racial wealth gap is getting greater, right? And so what I'm curious about as I think about my own work, and then also, you know, the work of especially economists and thinking with economists, is how do we attack the disease and not the symptoms? And so I'm wondering if it's our relationship to capital and relationship to capitalism that we really have to look at in terms of addressing these issues. And so thinking about policy, especially those that occurred in the early 20th century throughout, those that did privilege white space, white people, families, and again, disinvesting their urban core where mostly Black people lived, what are policies that have positively generated some kind of outcome for Black people where we can say that's a win? And so that's oftentimes I am critical of how we come up with policy, not policy in general, but to a certain extent, you know, we'll follow this a pattern. Well, we'll need to enact certain policies, laws, but they're not distributed equally. And I'm not sure all the time if policy can always achieve equity. So it's thinking about policy in addition to understanding how at different levels we can really impact change. So I think what Rucker's talking about is really important because that's at all levels. That's the federal level, that's the state level, that's local, and where we have to talk about these ways that people operate differently. Economies are different in different areas of the country. we think about how the suburbs are shifting, right? If we're thinking about exurbs and we're thinking about more rural contexts, that they're very different than the cities as cities are becoming wealthier and wider, honestly. And so this question of focusing on racism still requires us to understand this disease that's occurring and the disease that's been in the country and been so focused on, you know, what Rucker was talking about, this dependence on property, for example, to achieve wealth. How are there other ways that we can really achieve some kind of free life or freedom, especially for Black people, without necessarily depending on property or the accumulation of property and wealth? I don't have all the answers for sure, but I think it's a conversation that we do have to have, and how we're defining these terms and how we're focusing on, you know, what we want people to come out with, you know? So having, at a certain point, you know, I'm thinking about how important it is in the United States in particular. And I think this is something from our racial capitalism working group with the grad students and faculty. We're really thinking about how capitalism is really built upon like this racialized structure. And so this focus on housing, or the focus on really housing as this financialized tool now, does not benefit people of color at all. In fact, it's a disadvantage. Instead of thinking of housing as this right for people to have, this standard of living that we must have. And we might have to disarticulate our relationship again to property in order for us to understand how people are able to live freely and safely and healthily. That's the last point I'll say, actually, in thinking about the coronavirus. You know, it's really, we're having this reckoning right now where we're being told that we should stay indoors, stay in our homes. And for a lot of people, they don't have homes. As we know in the Bay Area, the homeless, the unhoused population is unreal in California. And especially now, you know, though a lot of cities have eviction moratoriums, some are expiring in various cities in the country. And so we have to think about the fact that we're telling people to stay indoors in order to remain safe, but even in some of those homes, they're not safe, right? So how do we create an environment where there aren't these inequities that are rampant because of your race, because of your gender, because of your sexuality? And so it's one of those things where the presumption that we can all just stay in place and shelter in place and be safe, it's not fair. It doesn't provide an opportunity for people to really thrive. So
I love all that. That's awesome. Can I give a rejoinder, Christian, of Brandi's comment before we turn to the next one? Yeah, so I totally agree. I think I'd love to hear your definition of racial capitalism, or kind of what the working group definition of what that means, just to make sure I'm on board with that. Not on board, but understanding what you were referring to. But I also think what you're saying is simply that how democracy and social cohesion come, that when they come into conflict of certain brands of capitalism. So I think there's not like one type. There is a type that has a space for universal access to healthcare, that has a space for a safety net that includes housing as an entitlement. That's not the one we're doing, but I'm saying it's not that it could not be constructed and co-constructed in this moment. So what we're really trying to say is, what COVID reminds us, right, is that how much health matters for the economy, how the opportunities to invest in education and health systems boost future growth. Remember, in the early part of the pandemic, we were getting a better awareness of like how much teachers are underpaid and underappreciated. And it was like shifting like a paradigm around, wow, we need to change the salary structure for teachers and invest in them. Somehow like that kind of got lost. I think we need to kind of bring that back to the center. But I think what I'm really saying is that, as your work has shown previously, Brandi, we have no safety net for small businesses, right? Particularly minority-owned businesses. And that fact will thwart entrepreneurial activity, not just right now, but for years to come. Because the way risk and risk assessment, and the fact that when you start a new business, the probability of failure, even our own intellectual work, we're like intellectual entrepreneurs. And one of the hallmarks of an intellectual entrepreneur is you got a lot of like failed projects, a lot of rejections on those first submissions, a lot of ideas that don't get to where the final destination is. And the point is, if we don't have a safety net that does the small business, and certainly your work in DC, I know works on, but it's like we have to think about the local, state, and federal response, not just focusing on the federal response, because a lot of these conversations that we're talking about actually are embedded more in state and local policy than in the the other pieces. So I think, and I'm about to hand off, but again, as you're saying, there's no safety net for housing. Housing is not an entitlement, and that's very problematic, and most problematic in recessions and pandemics, right? And so the fact that we don't have an eviction moratorium as a backstop to keep families, particularly those with children, from falling through the cracks, that there's no system for getting funding and rent paid to tenants, that's problematic. And even when we talk about education, right, who our essential workers are and what role schools play, not only in education, but supporting working parents. The fact that we don't have a robust investment in our childcare workers, and that when we say essential workers outside of healthcare, all of the workers that are deemed essential are almost all in low-wage jobs. Tell me a single essential worker that is in major living wage kind of level jobs, the way that our structure is. So I think the observation is simply that we have to come to terms with, when we don't value regulation of pollution, it also has devastating impacts on environmental justice issues. And who does that disproportionately affect? Again, communities of color. It intersects with a respiratory virus that escalates the spread of COVID. And that's been illustrated in the recent data as well. So again, I'm handing off, but I think I'm really just trying to reinforce many of the points that you already made, and certainly would like you to expound on from your own work that I know is certainly illuminating a lot of those points better.
Were you
if you would like to, Brandi.
In any direction that you kind of hear that kind of connects to your thoughts on that, I'd love to hear more.
I mean, I think this is why it's actually great to have an economist and a sociologist / geographer in conversation about this topic, because I think I think we end up in the same location. It's just how we get there might be slightly different. And so part of it is certainly, yes, as it relates. So, okay, there are a couple of things. You started in terms of thinking about or wondering about how we're talking about racial capitalism. And so there are a variety of definitions of it. And certainly from the working group, we were reading Cedric Robinson, but we were also reading others who were thinking more meaningfully about the relationship between race and capitalism, and racialism and capitalism in terms of its origins. And so for a lot of people who have read, Cedric Robinson and how he's essentially taking Marx to task for not considering race in this meaningful way in terms of thinking about the accumulation, thinking about capitalism, how we can think about this in the modern day is how, this process of getting both social and economic value from the racial identity of other people, right? And so from the example that you gave about essential workers, it is no coincidence that our essential workers, and again, we can think about what the term essential means, but versus first responders, right? So we have essential workers who are mostly Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and they're the ones who are most at risk. They're the ones who live in more cramped spaces, who have larger families, or at least living in multi-generation families in smaller homes. So again, if we're supposed to be sheltering in place, there's not this opportunity to actually create some kind of social distance if you're an essential worker, right? So it's thinking about race in that context and how capitalism, whether it be this the gig economy exploding, thinking about the role of Amazon and these other platforms that essentially are endangering the lives of the essential workers. But if they don't do these jobs, they won't be able to pay rent because the eviction moratorium may expire. So it's this cycle that continues. So again, I don't think we're in different locations. I do believe that we ultimately want the same thing, but I do question how we have this relationship to capitalism in that we're part of this same hamster wheel that's going round and round. As it relates to my own research, I was thinking more so in terms of how Blackness is exploited in order to get these gains, right? And so how the Blackness of Black bodies brings about a certain value in a particular moment. So historically, there's a particular value to a Black body that might be different today. As it relates to Black businesses, and especially in, commercial landscapes, there's a way that attaching this idea of what Blackness can be, representations of Blackness don't necessarily require Black people to be there. So you can still get some kind of value from Blackness without Black folks being in the area. And that's really important to understand, where you don't necessarily want to support, your small Black business, but you can support a business that might be selling Black wares, right? And so the owner doesn't necessarily have to be Black, but at least you're part of this system that is contributing to this distribution of some kind of Black material. So that's what I'm seeing that's going on more. I write about in my book. And I think it's important because we can look at the data, we can look at the numbers and really kind of see this distribution of wealth, but it's also important to see the ways that these ideas are exploited, or at least these identities are exploited in order to gain some type of profit based on the labor of others. And that's really coming to the fore as we're looking at, disproportionate outcomes as it relates to COVID. So I do want Christian to jump in and ask the question, but again, I don't think we're as far apart. I just think that we have different approaches in understanding it.
I mean, I would also just say, as a political scientist, part of what you said earlier, Rucker, about, and what Brandi actually said about, policy not necessarily giving us equity, part of how I think about this is what political scientists call path dependence and policy drift. Like, I think so much of what I'm seeing is a kind of an intractability in moving past certain frameworks of policymaking as, again, locked in generation after generation. And part of what's going on there, and what I think you've both touched on, is the ways that we kind of develop and secure wealth are themselves created through normative understandings that are themselves racialized. So when we think about housing, for example, and the mad dash to have housing, as Keeanga Taylor shows in her new book, Race for Profit, as you point out, Rucker, the FHA is backing the development of wealth in the United States in the post-Depression era. But when they decide to kind of, in the post-civil rights moment, to kind of say, well, let's think about how we have anti-discriminatory practices for Black communities, it does not actually end up working the same way. In fact, it becomes a way to kind of get Black people into subprime mortgages in dilapidated homes, right? We see the same thing happening with Tressie McMillan Econom's work in lower ed, where we're thinking about for-profit education, that is higher education is seen as such a normative good that people are bending over backwards and taking over massive amounts of debt just to have the insignia and the imprimatur of higher education, right? And they're going to for-profit colleges that are not going to give them the ROI that really would allow them to elevate themselves out of poverty. And so there are all these kinds of notions about what are happening that are either locked out or Black people are locked out of. And then when the door cracks open a little bit, it is a kind of a sordid entry. Right? It's something that allows them in entry, but also creates new and pernicious circumstances for them in the same breath. So I'm going to end there because I really want to kind of done with us talking, and I want to kind of invite some speakers. So what I will do is, I know people have been talking in the chat, so I'm going to invite them to kind of speak, and then we can kind of speak back to you. All right. So I want to start with.
I haven't been able to simultaneously look at the chat, so I apologize. But if someone else could help bring that to the fore, I'm all ears. Yeah. I just can't read while I'm listening.
Well, that's true. Maybe Steve, would you help moderate for us as we go? So I'm going to call a couple of people and I'll moderate, but as the three of us are talking, just maybe you can keep a cue for me. So why don't I start with Rakesh Bhandari? I know you had a couple of questions in the chat. If you'd like to just unmute yourself and just kind of like ask a couple of the questions you had earlier.
Thank you. I wrote up what I meant to ask, so I'll just give a shortened version of it. I was just wondering about the question of human capital in particular, especially in pre-K, because on the one hand we have, and I know this plays right to Rucker's expertise, on the one hand, we have the hard heredity theories of, from the bell curve. Those ideas I still think linger in American culture, that the cost of those investments, will outweigh whatever benefits we get, due to these theories. But on the other hand, it seems like there are those who find a panacea in human capital investments, in particular pre-K, as if improving the human capital profile of people will mean that they won't face discrimination or growth won't be located in places away from them. So I was just wondering, how to think about, so that was one thing. The second thing I was going to ask is about, I'll just leave the second question. I had a couple of things, but the second one is, I'm really interested in this concept of racial capitalism. And I'm wondering whether you want to theorize it, you want to make sense of it as a theoretical term or as a historical reality. Because if it's a theoretical term, I begin with, a abstract definition of capitalism is private ownership of capital goods, wage labor, production of commodities for a profit. How do I derive from that theoretically that capitalism is necessarily, or there's something intrinsic to capitalism that would be racial? Or do I not look at racial capitalism as a theoretical concept, but rather as a description of the brute historical reality of how the system has evolved? And, so the question of the theoretical or empirical nature of what we mean by racial capitalism. So a couple questions.
I'm going to defer the second one to you, Brandi, but I'm going to take his first one. Both are great questions. On the first, I think that there's a tendency toward either or, and it also plays toward the silos. Do we do pre-K or do we do K-12? Do we do K-12 or do we invest more in higher education? Do we do this? And then we don't realize, even this conversation about, say, defund the police. Defund the police is really more about, let's reset our priorities and our budgetary investments and think about more earlier investments in the life cycle that actually prevent future crime down the road, and think about how our commitments in the criminal justice space are crowding out the essential quality investments in the pre-K, K-12, as well as the health investments. So, those are real conversations that have tractable empirical legs to consider. But I think what we see is that the reason we mention wealth is because currently when people talk about and lift up the idea of school choice, what they leave out of the conversation is how wealth gives you the ability to exercise that choice. If you're low income and also particularly low wealth, you don't have the options to move when you're dissatisfied with the quality of the instruction and curricular quality or overcrowded schools. What middle class families do, again, particularly those with wealth, they're able to move and do other things to exercise that choice. But the point is, the wealth part isn't just a financial aid conversation that happens when people are in college. That happens at the pre-K affordability. All of us with young kids should all be fully aware of that component. And so we're talking about the pre-K through K-12 quality of school investments is distributional equity components, and the ways in which that's the root of the college readiness gap, as well as a big component of the fact that half of those who start college don't complete a degree within 6 years. And even though we have more people going to college than ever before, part of that is the college readiness gap. And then part of it is that as we have more diverse students going to college, we kind of have a higher education culture, not at Berkeley per se, but in general, that if students fall through the cracks, it is a reflection of their not having the right qualities and not necessarily institutional components that are not being welcoming, inclusion, belonging, and building out a diverse space for intellectual ideas to thrive. And that's something that is not supply demand. It's that intersection. I'm over my time, so let me punt to Brandi. But I guess that's what I would say. It's not either or. It's not pre-K investments can be a panacea. We find the dynamic complementarity that the pre-K investments make the investments in K-12 and higher ed much more productive. But when we don't do them in concert, strategically and equitably, then we're left with the kind of inequality that we see. And the inequalities we see are not a reflection of ability, but are a reflection of our lack of commitment to the equity of those investments. Brandi, please.
Thank you for that, both questions. The one thing I'll say on the end of what you said, Rucker, just specifically in terms of defunding the police, I think it's important to also think about those people who are actually trying to abolish the police. And so though all of the people who are supporting defunding the police aren't necessarily attempting to abolish, so many people are. And so I think part of that is recognizing the policing structure, thinking about institutions and how they do regulate communities, produce containment and surveillance, especially of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folk. And so there is this move where, you know, the idea is not just that we need to leverage our power and move around the money, essentially move around the coconut and provide it in other areas, social services, education, et cetera, but also that police don't do what we think they do. And so there isn't that same need, right? So that's an addendum to that part. As it relates to racial capitalism, it's both theory, and we have to really pay attention to the history. There's an empirical quality, right? And so again, as I mentioned, and I don't know if you've read Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, I'm sure, yeah, right? So as we're thinking about it, you know, as you know then, that Cedric Robinson was really taking Marx to task for not really considering this racial character of capitalism. And so, you know, thinking about the evolution, thinking about, you know, the dependence, or at least the system of racial capitalism being dependent on slavery, specifically violence, genocide, and imperialism, that still carries out today as we kind of think about the shores of the United States, right? And so the way I was mentioning it before in terms of essentially exploiting these other diverse bodies, right, as they've been kind of understood and racialized, is a symptom of that. And so you see these ways that empirically we recognize, not only in various institutions, and we can even talk about higher ed on a surface level, right? How much the value of diversity goes up, how much funding goes into diverse or creating a diverse student body, and what it means to market and brand diversity in those types of institutions. It's the same as we think about in the media, if we think about in the government, right? And so how we value ideas like diversity really come down to how the economy kind of circulates around capitalism profiting off of racialization. And so I think that certainly, and again, I think, you know, Rucker was talking about it in terms of the need to historicize, the need to understand what happened previously in order to understand what's happening now, and also think about what's happening in the future. And that's why, you know, originally I was mentioning repair. We really need to think about what it means to repair and our relationship to capitalism in order to figure out what the best solution is. For many, it's essentially blowing up the system and starting all over again, because the system has been built to privilege some and exclusively like prevent others from having life, from living, from breathing, for years, right? For getting old. And so I think it's important to kind of pay attention to what they're saying, that it's not just about destruction and gloom, but really trying to see how we can come together and form a different reality, because the one we have right now is not equitable, nor is it just.
I mean, I'll make an addendum to the addendum then. I think it's important because this point about defunding the police, abolishing the police, is a really important one. But it kind of touches on what I always call the representational quality of racial capitalism, because in some ways the radicalism or the lack thereof is kind of shaped completely by who you think is making the call. So in some ways, the idea of defunding the police is in rapid succession becoming a more respectable understanding of how to do this, right? We'll move the money around because that is something that we can kind of see as a kind of a motion that is not something that is insurrectionary. Whereas the move from defunding to abolishing or abolition of police is seen as something that is a bridge too far and is always cast to the kind of a darker hue of the messenger, right? And so when we think about what happens and how certain policies get hamstrung over and over again, a big reason for that is because of who is seen as kind of a worthy messenger for a type of policy platform, or even a kind of a framework for justice. It's not even just about policy all the time. So I'll say that. So next on my queue, we have Jared Finnegan.
Hi, thanks. Thanks very much for the very interesting discussion. I guess my question is a bit different, perhaps more something on a bit narrow, and it was to Rucker about education policy. And I'm just curious. I mean, I should mention I'm a postdoc in the Department of Environmental Science Policy and Management. So I don't study education policy, but I'm curious about how sort of the funding of schools in the US. And my sense, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about that first, but my sense is that local funding and devolved funding structures lead to unequal outcomes and perhaps maintain those unequal outcomes. So how is it when, and how might it be different, I guess? How might the politics of education be different if it were allocated from the center, from the federal government, as it is in many other countries? I mean, I know in the case of zoning, there's some work on zoning and of course housing, right? And because local communities can control that, you end up with quite discriminatory practices and quite unequal outcomes. Thanks.
Great question. Thank you. So I'll try to be brief, but I think the main thing that we've historically had a heavy reliance on local property tax base to fund local schools, and that differences in local property wealth, really driven by the residential segregation by both race and class, kind of has created systems and also incentive structures to also gerrymander the school district boundary lines so that there's economic incentives to segregate. Now, what I'm just suggesting is that we're in a regime right now where we're kind of glad that the federal government doesn't have that much say in education policy, because of currently Betsy DeVos' vision of what public education is really to dismantle public education and its mission. So I'm not going to comment on the federal role, but typically, historically and currently, the state and local levels is really what shapes the governance structure of schools and its funding. And the point is that the digital divide with COVID and other things are gonna basically, the politics of school reform tend to be toward incrementalism. And I think the bigger conversation that's coming up is there's different theories of social change that exude beyond education equity. And certainly education resource equity is part of in this conversation. But if we think about different theories of social change, there's one view that's like glacial progress, and it's like more gradual in nature. You hear like the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. What we're trying to say is, yes, it bends toward justice, but the timing and the speed requires some force that requires movements that recognize sometimes you need discontinuous, bold policy responses that view incrementalism as a status quo and insufficient to the task. So if the task is not commensurate with the challenge of the problem, then we have to abort the kind of incrementalism and say, okay, let's think about restructuring and reimagining the system from both the inside and out. And what I'm saying, that kind of change requires four things to coalesce. And this is why having this conversation in our university environment really excites me, These four things are happening as we speak. Number one, that the problem attracts widespread public and political attention. Unfortunately, it's through the tragedy of Black lives and them not mattering that is raising that visibility. Unfortunately, it's the 210,000 lives from COVID lost. It's the lack of federal leadership that's kind of bringing that problem's attention. That's unfortunate, but you know, let's not waste any tragedy. Let's use it for the good. And number two is that there be a proposal with actionable solutions that are agreed upon by the major actors. Number three, that there's a champion to vigorously push the policy proposal through thick and thin. That is, if it's school resource equity, I'm gonna be that champion because it's evidence-based championship on that part. Then you have to have a transformational political event that creates an open policy window to enact the agreed upon proposal. What I'm saying is this moment is like, you know, there's an idea that like DNA skips a generation. I'm gonna say we did a generation of incrementalism. This is the time to return to the kind of 1960s style policy movements that reshaped opportunity. I believe that this is the opportunity, this is the time. We're talking about 4 decades of income inequality gone unabated. We're talking about wealth inequality. Like, we've gotten all of these points. This is the time to pursue these bigger ideas. And I would just say our research needs to be commensurate to the task. We don't need to be taking on these little tiny evaluations of really small incrementalist reform if we want to think about what's needed in relationship to the problem. Now, if the problem is small, do the little tinkering. I'm cool with that. But if the problem is not small, our policy identification strategy should not be fixated on small, because we're going to get small policy prescriptions from that formation. So I know I'm way over my time. So let me again try to pause and definitely tag the rest of everybody. But I hope that that speaks a little bit. I didn't get all the way into school resource equity and the details because you would be with me for a lot longer than 15 minutes. So I just put that like more on the side. But certainly there's a lot of evidence that school money matters, those investments matter, and particularly beginning in the early years. And when we don't have those investments, and in many states, they're not equitable. Most states, they're not equitable.
David Haitha.
Yes, thanks. I greatly appreciate the discussion. I use a lot of what you folks do, which is I work on some community development things, both here and internationally and nationally both. And my recommendation as a user of what's produced in political economy and the things you're focusing on is really the 2-track. And that is that as a user of this, the big issues that Rucker just talked about, those are really important. We have to get those out there, and you have to characterize them, and they take time. But what I find is specific issues with specific data are often the best entry points. For example, I'm working with a couple of organizations, including Brookings, on one side on valuing Black neighborhoods. Well, it turns out that there is a cultural factor. So not only is the federal government denied FHA loans to African-American families up through 1970, as we know, in certain neighborhoods, but that whole cultural value meant that if you took away everything except the Blackness of a neighborhood, crime rates, location, everything else, African-American property in the United States home ownership is likely undervalued by somewhere around $156 billion. Now, what does that mean? That's money that's not in African-American families' pockets. So that kind of hard-hitting close enough. It's a long story. I'm happy to go through that offline. I'm just getting involved in that story a little bit. But these are cases where there's that's a specific different way that shows the political economy, both the economic, cultural, and political aspects involving in these issues, that those provide near-term arrows, which really are very, very good at targeting near-term action. And they don't preclude the bigger issues that you're discussing. So that's why as a methodology for the greater world beyond the wonderful community that's assembled here, that would be very, very useful to have that two-track.
I completely agree. Let's just say amen on that.
And I want to jump in and just say, I think that's why it shows the significance and the necessity for both quantitative and qualitative data in order to understand how, you know, just what you were talking about, the cultural importance and vibrance of neighborhoods doesn't necessarily come down to an economic value for many people. And so you can't really buy a certain sense of belonging or community or just, you know, neighborhood, honestly, and connection between people. And so when you actually have to minimize the value of someone's life in terms of their community that they've built, it becomes more difficult to provide answers for how they're able to remain. And so you'll see this in terms of, you know, looking at the data on displacement. On the one hand, you can talk about what percentage of people are actually able to come back to their neighborhoods. For example, if, you know, public housing is torn down and something is rebuilt in its place, right? If you have mixed income housing. So for those who do come back, certainly they come back to a new home, they come back to probably better services and amenities, but they also come back to neighbors that they don't know, community, you know, relationships that they have to form again, if possible. And the folks that weren't able to move back typically have to move further away. And so there's that part of the community fabric that oftentimes isn't necessarily incorporated or thought about because it doesn't have, you can't determine an economic value to that. And so it becomes more complicated. And that's why I think the coupling of policy with other prescriptions can help us think about what's lost when there is that shift and what can be gained if you actually listen to how people use space, how people live in their communities, rather than understanding, you know, ways that we can, you know, try to get a bigger home, try to get more space and more property. Certainly those things are important in terms of having land to cultivate, right? Not destroying the environment, but actually finding ways to produce an environment that's healthy, right? But at the same time, we do need to really recognize the significance of how people live and how they want to live.
And I mean, and that just goes to show what I'm seeing is like, even these kinds of questions of community development, of renewal and replenishment are themselves racialized concepts when they're put into the context of how do you develop and retain communities. And if you're thinking about not just value in terms of a monetary matter, but value in terms of what it means to be a part of a community, these things are incredibly tied and often mismatched from one community to another. Steve, I know you had a question.
I first of all wanted to thank both panelists for just amazing discussion and presentations. I'd like to give maybe one question to each. So Rucker, you started off saying that there were limits to race neutral policies. And then later you gave us this very motivational kind of 4-point argument about how this, you know, if anything's gonna happen, this would be the moment. So building on that, I just wanted to ask you, which policies do you think, assuming there's a change in power after the election, which policies that would go beyond kind of race neutral policies are most politically feasible? What can really happen? Then my question for Brandi, and forgive me if I'm kind of misunderstanding you, but I think you said there in there somewhere that, you know, there's some problems that don't have policy solutions, or that policy is not the solution to every problem. So I kind of wanted to invite you to expand upon that. I'm not saying, I know you're not saying that policy is never a solution, but for things where policy isn't the solution, you know, then what do we do? Are you meaning community-based organizing? Are you talking about, you know, a complete change in the way we, you know, in social norms? You know, some sort of a social movement that transcends, you know, specific policy measures. Just your thoughts on kind of what that might look like.
Great. Both great questions. Okay. So I'm going to try to be very judicious with my time. Okay. So the first point is, right, we're saying systematic problems require systematic solutions. So when we say systematic, school resource equity, changing the structure of school funding, that's a structural reform. protecting voting rights, criminal justice reform, ending predatory lending, promoting mixed income housing, environmental justice, universal health care, quality pre-K that's targeted particularly for low-income students. Okay, but let me just add a couple things. We're all part of this system, and the beauty of it is that we all can recommit ourselves to be part of the solution. And because we're on this campus, a progressive idea-generating campus. We don't even have to mention the Nobel laureates that won, within this last week. We're owning as academicians our part of contributing to the problems we see. And we're being reflective about how we respond to push our research, our teaching, our policy work, and our influence in our respective disciplines to rise to the challenge. We're evolving because we're not going to be extinct. And the key thing about this is we can't afford to be colorblind if the aim is to create just policies and efficient ones too. And what I guess I would just add to this is when we in classrooms have discussions of race, I had an op-ed and the tentative title was, when discussions of race in the classroom are relegated to the back of the bus, or the classroom, or the boardroom, or the courtroom, or the dorm room. Like when those conversations don't happen, when we have an establishment or status quo that have their earplugs in and don't hear the multiracial chorus of voices resounding, demanding, loudly in the streets of protest, activists, young voices that haven't yet learned to succumb to the numbing effect of incrementalism, when we imagine that world of new possibilities of the equity journey that's typically led by the younger people, what I'm saying is don't let the research community be behind that movement, like behind. I mean, get behind, but like, don't be like trailing that. We need to be part of helping to lead and cultivate that. So when we have the passing of the baton and the symbolism of the passing of John Lewis crossing the Pettus Bridge again, and the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the point of that is they're passing a baton. We have to be actively engaged in taking that baton. And what I'm saying about policy prescriptions, there's two on the ballot that have nothing to do with the federal level. They have everything to do with what's happening at our local level, right? We have Prop 16. It's our chance to end the ban on affirmative action and expand opportunity for all. Now, we have significant research evidence compelling on the long-term detrimental effects of university affirmative action bans on racial equity, but it's really that our university system, the socioeconomic diversity, we have more people from low-income backgrounds at UC Berkeley than any other, than the Ivy League combined. And the racial equity part of that means that we want to have diverse and interactive kinds of conversations from diverse perspectives. That valuing of that diversity, it's not priced appropriately. That value can't be quantified. That kind of leadership quality that it cultivates in our students in their future leadership endeavors can't be fully like, I don't have a like specific marker, but I know what it looks like when we start retreating on that commitment. It starts looking like what we see right now. And Proposition 15 is an additional one on the November ballot with large consequences for expanding educational opportunity and funding. If passed, it'll raise up to $12 billion in new revenues for education and local governments by requiring many commercial and industrial properties to be assessed at fair market value. So again, I'm sorry I was long-winded, but those are the things that I think are actionable right now and that we should be very serious about internalizing and acting upon. Thanks for the great question, Steve. Brandi, I will close this out.
Oh, or by closing it out.
Well, I'm just saying, I think I took so much time that unfortunately, I want you to close this out. I mean, in addition to your response to Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, for that question. And I think it's important to clarify. And so as I was talking, certainly, yes, I do think policy can be attached to other things, or there have to be multiple things going on at once, right? And so I'm really thinking about what's currently happening. So if we think about, the organizing around the movement for Black Lives, and they certainly focus on local policy and thinking about making changes to policy, but also thinking about it in terms of this longer historical arc of Black radical tradition and ways that, Black people, specifically this collection of cultural, intellectual, and really action-oriented labor that was really focused on disrupting the political, economic, and cultural norms that originated in terms of thinking, post-slavery, right? During and post-slavery. And so that tradition is continuing now. So really it's focusing on how you pair policy prescriptions with these anti-colonial efforts in order to make it that marginalized people are able to live freely. And so that actually speaks to when I was talking about renewing or changing our relationship to capitalism. So that incorporates, mutual aid. We're seeing so much, we're seeing political organizing in different communities where they're enacting mutual aid in order to support people, right? And so that's not necessary. Policy is not going to necessarily encompass that, right? You have to think about the needs of various communities. But really that's drawing on a longer Black radical tradition that is focused on communities, that's focused on doing multiple things at once. It's drawing from, Marronage in Haiti and the United States, right? Thinking about revolt and this longer history of African diaspora communities that have figured out ways to continue through slave trade, right? To live in this country and kind of in the diaspora by enacting these various methods of survival. And so it includes intellectual engagement, so scholarship, right? Doing the kind of work, writing to really enhance our understanding, our intellectual understanding of what's happening, of our history. And so that's why, I've mentioned, I didn't mean to mention Cedric Robinson so much, but mentioning Cedric Robinson is important because you're seeing this intellectual history that pushes against something that's been a norm, an idea that's been a norm, an ideology. That type of work is really important in terms of understanding how we come to the table. So again, it's more so understanding, yes, community organizing, but all cultural, intellectual, and labor that really goes into shifting particular narratives and really having action-oriented steps to make some changes.
Yeah, and I think to reinforce what, can you still hear me? Yeah. To reinforce again what Brandi's saying, it's the policy's not enough alone. It's policy and implementation. It's policy, implementation, and research. It's research, policy, practice, and community. It's how do we integrate the parts across sectors of education, health, public safety, and entrepreneurial and labor market kind of things that spur economic growth. Like, how do we do and connect these pieces in integrated ways? And I think it's as we do those connections together, we can ensure a much brighter future that prevents many of the social problems that are symptoms of a broken system. So thank you for all of the points that have come through, and we hope that this will be just the first of many.
Yeah. I mean, what I'll just say this to close, and thank you all so much for your time. I want to let you go. It's, in my mind, about moving beyond the frameworks that capitalism gives us to thinking beyond and above it. So I'll just end right there. Thank you all so much for your time and for your engagement. Thank you so much again to Professors Rucker Johnson and Brandi Summers and Steve and Richard for putting this all together. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for coming and listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for having us.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.